Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Lacey. I'm the CEO of Mobomo. I want to thank everybody for joining one of our digital meetup series. In each one of these events, we're going to be going through the various aspects of the software development process, including human-centered design, project management, best practices in software engineering, and quality assurance. In today's event, our QA lead, Eduardo, will be going over QA metrics and ways of tailoring them to make sure that your development team is making the most of them to create high quality products in a fast-paced development process. A little bit about our company. We are an award-winning provider of mobile, web, and cloud applications in the federal agencies and large enterprises. We combine leading-edge technology and human-centered design and strategy to craft next-generation of digital experiences. Our clients include NASA, NOAA, USGS, the GSA, the DoD, Gallup, and a lot of cutting-edge startups. I'd like to point out that we are always hiring talent, so please visit our website for open positions or send your resume to hiring@mobomo.com. That's hiring@mobomo.com. And with that, I'll hand it over to Eduardo to start.
Okay, hi everyone. So as Brian mentioned, I'm the QA director for Mobomo. My job here is to create and improve software assurance quality standards company-wide, and I'm here today to launch a new series dedicated specifically to quality assurance. Now, to start off, on this first meetup, we're going to target an area that is most of the times neglected as part of QA. Mainly, the difference between quality control and quality assurance is that not only you should care about the final quality achieved, but also the way in which it was achieved. And for that, you need to be able to understand basically the development process. And the most effective way to do so is through metrics. And that's what leads us to the topic today, metrics. As far as the agenda, we'll be kicking off things by going through an introduction using a very simple example to understand the basic concept. Then we're going to think about why would someone want metrics, how you can get them, and we're going to try to answer if you actually need metrics. So to start off, a brief introduction on the word itself. Metrics is a word that basically falls in line with a group of words called buzzwords. And for those that don't know what those are, basically they're technical terms that have their original technical meaning removed through fashionable use. And they're most of the times used just to impress others. Words like future-proof, AI, decoupled, that sort of thing that without context means nothing. Now, metrics was one of the first buzzwords that came up, or at least it was used in that sense. And the interesting thing is that since that first time, it actually evolved into something else. A new term arose that basically means, well, it stands for vanity metrics, actually, that's how it's mentioned nowadays. And it is when people start acting on something without understanding what it is. Since metrics can be numbers, they basically take that and start gathering data and acting upon it. And the main difference between just gathering data and actual metrics is that they need to have meaning. They need to serve a purpose, have an objective, target a particular process. Worse off, they start using it to compare things, to compare different things. And sometimes it's used as bragging rights. And basically, if the conditions are not given and if you don't have a clear company-wide standard, then comparing makes no sense. So before we dwell too much in this path of what metrics are not, like I mentioned, let's start by taking a step back and looking at a very simple example that is actually outside of the software industry. We'll go into that later, but just to kick things off, let's start talking by the Empire State Building. Most of you know it. It's a massive building. It is over 100 stories tall, and it's so massive that it has 70 lifts to have people go up and down. And the question here would be, how long did it take to complete that massive building? And the answer is quite astonishing for me, at least the first time I heard about it. It's barely over a year. And if you look at the peak velocity, meaning the amount of stories that got completed per week, it was over 4, meaning they would have completed the building I'm speaking on right now in around 3 weeks, which is insane. Well, and here's what we're going to try to analyze through this first example is how they got to build it in such a short period of time? And the answer is they kept track of the metric tons of steel that got delivered to the site. They would have this massive scales in which they would weigh trucks that went in and went out to just have an accurate measurement of the amount of steel that got into the site. And what we're going to try and do right now is try to understand how they got from metric tons of steel to completing a building in over a year, a massive building in over a year. And to do that, we need to kind of understand the process in which things are built, which is kind of simple, but we basically need to gather materials and then start working with those to create a building. And once you're out of materials, means everything got put into the building, and the only thing left is an inauguration ceremony. If we look historically at what happened at that time, there was a race to get the tallest building as fast as possible. And we're talking about the 1930s. So basically, human resources, labor was cheap and was abundant. So that was probably not the bottleneck, and they realized this soon enough. So they basically analyzed the materials part, what materials would be more difficult to gather. And that's where the placing or the building site was taken into account. We're talking about Manhattan, which is one of the most dense cities in the world. And basically, they went through all the different materials that they needed to gather and selected which one would be the bottleneck. In this case, it was the huge chunks of steel that got delivered. They were custom made. And just picture having a massive truck delivering massive chunks of steel in the middle of Manhattan. It's a nightmare. So they quickly decided that was the factor that they wanted to take care of and maximize to get the most out of the building process. And an important thing is that they not only needed to gather them as fast as possible into the site, but also put it into the building as fast as possible, because if not, they would just start stacking and they would have no place to put it. And this was kind of a review and improve process where they did some things like, for example, adding the rivets on the ground so they could be put into the building faster. Not so big, but basically it talks about not only deciding what to follow, but also a review and improve process. And that's how they got from measuring the tons of steel to finishing the building in a bit over a year. And that's kind of the concept that we're going to go through this evening. A metric is just a number that tells you important information about a process that's happening. In this case, the tons of steel directly relate to the completion of the building. If you need 1,000 tons and you're 500, you're basically half there. And outside of context, in any other kind of situation, it might mean nothing. It's just a number. They tell you accurate measurements about how the process is working, and it basically provides a base to suggest improvement. This is very important, and we're going to talk about this throughout the rest of the presentation. So the idea here is that we try to avoid using metrics as a buzzword, and that you can identify people that are using it as such. And for that reason, we're going to move to the first question here, which is, why would someone want to have metrics? And the answer is quite simple. If you have metrics, means that you have understood what your organization does, and you have processes in place that help you manage efficiency, quality. It talks about an mature organization, and therefore, basically, it allows you to work on those processes you already have. Moreover, since they're basically numbers, it's quite easy to make them objective so that they're not basically dependent on each of the process you're tracking. It depends on it should not depend on the people that are tracking those. So basically, it allows you to have a consistent control system that allows you to work without interference. And also, one of the most important and things that differentiate this from other improvement cycles is you can measure quantitatively measure the improvement of the changes you're making. It's one thing to say that it's better, and with metrics or with the aids of this system, you can actually measure how much better it is. Is it 20% better? Is it 50% better. And basically, those are things that you can only get through metrics or through a similar system where you analyze the processes deeply. Before we move on, I just wanted to mention quickly one thing, but there are basically two types of metrics. There's operational metrics and there's financial metrics. Operations are the one that come to mind more easily, basically the process of building something, and the financial metrics target the ability of an organization to turn those operational performance into financial goals. Usually in an organization or a full system, you would have a collection of metrics to provide a better picture of how the organization is working. And it's actually the way to do it. It's a good strategy to have a combination of metrics to measure that you have an effective process. And what we're going to focus on for the examples that we're going to give later are basically the first one, the operational ones, because they're easy to understand. Okay, so now we know we want metrics. It talks well about our organization. The next question is, how can we get them? And this one is kind of the tricky part. We're going to go through a simple example, and the idea is that you follow up, and you can basically apply the same principle to every other aspect or any other process that is at your disposal. So first off, since metrics measure processes, you need to define your own. So the easiest way to kick things off is to basically describe your process. When you describe it, you're basically understanding it. And what you need to do is gather all the documentation that is available, talk to the people that are involved into the productive process. And one very useful thing is to review things that you've completed in the past and all that information that provides a lot of insight into the process itself. And once you understand the process, or at least define the process that you want to follow, you might need to make some changes, which means probably undergoing some training with key people. And also it's important that everyone uses the same vocabulary. This is what's known as standardization, and it allows everyone to share the same terms and ensures consistency in what is being communicated by people from different areas. Okay, so we have our process. The next thing is basically dissect it. Make sure that you divide it into different steps or understand what are the most risky parts of the process. What do you feel might eventually be problems to it? Or perhaps even what aspects or parts of the process have the most impact on the overall outcome. And therefore, you have a particular thing that you want to keep track of. And what comes next is actually gathering the information to just make sure that that part of the process is working as expected. One important thing to mention here is that you need to try sampling or different tactics to reduce ambiguity. One of the most important things is that all the data that is gathered should be objective, so it should be impartial. And also, talking about certainty, you might be using calculations over the data that is gathered. And if you're not certain about the values that you're getting, then that error could be further traced into the calculations, and it might be difficult to track the original source of it. So all in all, just basically be sure that the values that you're gathering are correct. And that's basically how a metric is born. It's basically what we discussed in the example of the Empire State Building. You first define your process, then you identify the key factors that you want to track, and when you have that defined, then you go out and actually search for information that tells you the status of those key factors. Let's try to put it down to earth with an example, something that we can understand. We're going to basically describe a process and find a key factor, and then try to extract a metric from it. In order to do so, let's provide some context. So we have a very simple product. We're talking about a software. We're talking about software. So we have a very simple product. There's a developer and a tester, and we sort of have these task orders, these tickets that come from the client directly, and the developer needs to work on it. The QA tests it to make sure that everything is fine, and it gets delivered to the client. That's the whole system. Now, if we write or try to define a process, we can actually see it as a timeline, and you have a client that first provides a ticket. The ticket has the description of what needs to be developed, and it also comes with an acceptance criteria that tells the developer and the tester what exactly is the key points that the developed functionality need to meet in order to be accepted. Okay. Oh, sorry. And after that ticket goes into the plate of the developer, he works on it, and it gets tested by the tester. If everything is fine, it is closed. And there are a couple of options. The tester only accepts it if the acceptance criteria is met. And also, just by chance, the tester can find something that's wrong about the system that is completely outside of the scope of what's being done right now, but he still needs to report it. Now, if we want to dissect this a bit, we can try to devise a flow diagram that represents what can happen. So let's start off by the ticket that gets provided by the client, and basically the developer works on it and develops the functionality, and it gets to a testing step. Now, in this testing step, we have the first fork. If the acceptance criteria is met, then the ticket is passed, and that's the end of it. The second thing that can happen is that the acceptance criteria does not get accepted, and basically the ticket needs to get reopened, further developed, and it goes through a cycle until the actual criteria is passed, and therefore the ticket gets delivered to the client. And like I mentioned, there's another option. If the tester finds something that is not related to the ticket, he will raise an issue and report it to the client so that he can deal with it. Now, in here, we can identify a couple of things that might be important to the process. Let's define like the minimum path would be that everything is okay and the ticket gets passed as soon as possible. The first thing that can go wrong is that you find something that is wrong with the system and you need to report it. That takes time out of the tester, and it also adds work because it needs fixing. So basically, this is something that we might want to keep track of. Second thing is basically when an acceptance criteria is not met, meaning that there's a problem with the ticket or the requirement definition. And therefore, those are the two key factors of the process that we want to keep track of. And here I've listed possible metrics. These are not all the metrics that you can find on this process, but just an example, we can keep track of the number of bugs that get found, and we could do the number of reopened tickets. And to explain what the process of actually interpreting these values is, it sometimes makes sense to present the information in a different way. For example, instead of talking about the number of reopened tickets, it might make more sense to just talk about the ratio of reopened tickets, something like efficiency. Out of 10 tickets that go through the process, how many got reopened? Just as an example, if 2 out of 10 get reopened, then the efficiency is 80%, so to speaking. And then you can also count the times the tickets were reopened more than once, because it's basically a red flag. The ticket got reviewed, the functionality got reviewed, it was sent for correction, and it still came back wrong. So it's kind of like a red alarm. If this number is more than 1, then you have a problem. And that's how you have your metrics: the number of bugs found and the ratio of reopened issues. So we have those. What to do next? How do you take care of metrics? What do you do with them once you have them? And the first thing that you need to understand, and it was kind of implicit on the first example, is that there is certain values that are, worse than others. And this comes to categorization. Basically, you need to develop a range. And metrics do not always fall in the same line. So there's a range in which you're able to live with those values and you won't act upon those. And when they fall out of that range, then you need to act and improve them. Sometimes it's easy to understand what your tolerable value is. For example, everything is fine if we reopen less than 2 tickets out of 10. That's basically a tolerable value. The other thing that can happen is you can have estimated values. For example, if you're working on a team that closes 4 tickets per week, then that's basically an estimated value. And if it doesn't deviate much from that central value, everything is fine. And there might be instances where you're tracking something that you have no idea what it's supposed to be. And what you can do is set up an initial value and then course correct based on what you're getting. If you think the process is going fine and you're getting a value different than the initial one, you correct it. So you categorize it. And just to review the whole process once again, once we've established the process and everything that's a given, you gather the information and then you interpret the data basically to gather the metric values. And then you categorize those values, and what's left is to basically keep track of those values over time and make sure that they don't deviate from the tolerable values or range. And to keep stacking to the example, let's go back one more time and try to see if we can keep track of our metrics. And before we start, we need to provide a bit more context. So let's say we're working on an agile project, meaning that the time axis is going to be sprints. We're going to have different sprints. So far, we've worked on 9 sprints, and we're tracking the number of bugs and the efficiency, as I mentioned it, about the tickets that go through the process without being reopened. If you look at the graphs, we're talking about having less than 5 bugs found per sprint. And as far as the efficiency, it's around 76%. And what we want to do here is, let's say our tolerance was up to 80% efficiency, and this has dropped below that. So we want to work on efficiency to just try and make it better. And in here comes like the detective part of this whole thing, where you need to identify the possible causes of what is bringing your metric down. And just providing examples, there could be a problem with code quality, but you know that you have a senior developer. He has a good track record, and he's worked fine with the client in the past, perhaps with other clients. So you're not going to pursue that just yet. Another option would be that tickets are incomplete, but that's kind of easy to follow up. You basically grab a selection or a random sample of tickets and go through those. And let's imagine that for the sake of the example, the tickets look okay. They have all the pertinent information, they can be understood, and they have a valid acceptance criteria. So what we're going to try and pursue in this example is basically requirement gathering. That's what we're going to try and act upon, meaning that the tickets are well written, they're just not correctly interpreted by the developer because some requirements are implicit or missing. And what we're going to try and add is basically a session for grooming, so that the developers and the client can get together and just make sure that they're on the same page when it comes to developing the functionality. And what can happen after introducing this change, having this grooming sessions? Well, there might be basically 3 outcomes. The ideal thing is that the metrics improve, that we move from a 76 to an 85% efficiency. There might be a chance that there's actually no change. The grooming sessions have not fixed the problem, and we might need to look somewhere else. And obviously it can backfire and you reduce the efficiency and make it lower. This is basically the 3 possible outcomes that you want to have. Okay, so bear with me just for a second, because so far it seems kind of straightforward, but there's one more thing that you need to take care of, and those are secondary metrics. Primary metrics are what we're kind of used to, what we're discussing so far. Those are the ones that you want to track and keep track of, act upon, and make sure that they improve. They have an implicit set of traits. For example, that it obviously describes the desired condition. It helps you get to that desired condition. It should have little to no time lag, meaning that if you introduce change, you should see the results as soon as possible. If not, basically by the time you realize that the change backfired, there's a chance that you cannot go back, or the damage is just too much for it to be reversed. And it's very important that it's not open to manipulation, meaning in this particular example, you should rely or basically know that when something gets reopened, it gets tracked, and it's not object to manipulation, because if not, you're getting data that is not trustworthy. Basically, if a metric allows for people to behave in such a manner, then it has not been efficiently chosen. It needs to be rethought. Now, these are primary. What are the secondary metrics? And these are intuitive, but most of the time we don't actually take care of those. These are things that should not change or that should remain the same after a change is introduced to the system. They help provide an overarching picture of the whole process so that you avoid problem shifting, which is not per se bad, but you just need to make sure that you're winning more than you're losing. If not, even though the metric had a positive impact, you might be losing somewhere else. This concept can be better explained if we go one last time to the example. And what we're going to do is, following the same scenario, we're going to add another more thing into it. So again, a bit more of context. So let's say we already know that we introduced the change of the grooming and it was successful. So the efficiency was increased from 76% to 81%, meaning that we're above our tolerable value. And we were tracking a secondary metric, which was velocity. And velocity is just the amount of tickets that got completed per sprint. And for the first 9 sprints before we actually introduced the change, that value was 52. So we had, on average, 52 tickets completed per sprint. And the idea would be to see what happened to the secondary metric when we successfully increase the efficiency. And for the sake of the example, what happened on this example is, although we increased the efficiency to 81%, we decreased the velocity to 40. So that's 20%. And this is not per se bad. It might require further analysis. Basically, the tickets might have been more difficult to complete or to accomplish than the previous ones. But the idea here is that it's not always straightforward to see that the change you've introduced has had a positive impact. Even if the metric that you were trying to improve improves, you still need to take a look at the overall picture. There's a lot of analysis that goes into making sure that you're tailoring the process in the right direction. And before we move on, just as a sort of summary, how do you get metrics? There's no easy way of getting one. That's basically why they're so easily turned into vanity metrics, because it requires a lot of effort, a lot of patience, people that have this analytical skill that can search for improvements all the time, and the drive to see through and keep pushing forward, making the necessary changes. A lot of thought needs to go into having a complete system that works. They can be tracked, followed, and worked on. It just needs dedication. Okay, so now we know how to get them. The next question that we need to answer is, do you need them? And for this one, what I did was try to think of instances where someone would not be able to get those. And the first example would be that the organization itself is not mature enough, have a lot of different projects, there's a lot of technologies going around. This means that you're hiring people and letting them go to just supply the needs. So there's a lot of job cycling, and basically this means that there's a morphing team structure. Everything is chaotic. So until we find some stability or some way of doubling down on a certain thing in particular, it's very difficult to introduce metrics to this sort of environment. The second one would be where there is no information or no way of gathering data. Although metrics is not data gathering, you still need data to be able to act upon things. And this is when there's no reporting, there's no use of any type of tracking of work, and there's no meetings or no way of interconnecting with people's work whatsoever. So basically, you can successfully interpret data if there's no data. And the last one would be when there's no process. And basically, if there's no process, there can be no metrics, since metrics are basically what helps you understand a process. So these are three examples of why you wouldn't be able to get metrics. So I kind of want to rethink the whole question of do you need them? We've seen that metrics are very interesting tools to improve and work on your processes. And they talk about mature organizations that understand what they do and how they do it. So instead of asking, do I need metrics? The right question would be, do I need them right now? Perhaps I need to work on other stuff, improve the way we document, improve the way we work, improve our processes, and then start thinking about metrics. And having said that, let's move to a conclusion and some final remarks. Metrics are kind of a complicated term, not only because of what they imply and what they become in the society, but because they're complex. We started with a very simple example about a building that portrays how you can use them, but especially in the software industry, what we do, the processes are quite complex. There's different stages to it. Every time you get a deployment, anything can happen. There's a lot of parties involved. There's a lot of technologies, different ways of interfacing, and this is ever growing. It's not like it's going to get any easier. And it makes it sound like it's something unobtainable, but in truth, it's not that difficult. You just need to make sure that you follow a certain path so that you don't put effort into something that is not going to yield any results. The most important thing is to take the decision to start going the metrics way and say, I want to track metrics and understand my processes. The second one is to basically define key factors and stuff that you want to keep track of. And then gather information that helps you understand or keep track of those parts. Once you do that over time, naturally, you're going to be able to understand and say which values are bad, which have yielded ill results, and which actually were good, and that will yield a reliable categorization. You will be able to assess through metrics if something is good or not. And once you've done that, then you basically did it. You have a metric system that allows you to understand if a process is doing okay or not. And you must never forget that there's an additional step, which is basically going over what you've done, what you know, and just contesting it to make sure that everything is working fine. There's always chance for improvement. And having said that, hopefully now metrics do have meaning for all of you, or at least, well, those that have been paying attention. Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you very much for your time, and hopefully see you next time.